welcomes you all this evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I've prepared a special collection of night shift stories for you to enjoy. So, sit back, relax, and let the darkness take over as we dive into some chilling tales that are sure to send a shiver down your spine. Story: The Warehouse on Coldridge Lane. My name's Mark, and my first job out of high school was working as a night security guard at a warehouse on Coldridge Lane. It was a large, decrepit building that used to be a textile factory decades ago, but now it stored everything from office furniture to antique furniture. It was an eerie place, as if it had been forgotten by time itself. The lights flickered a lot, and the air always felt damp, no matter the season. It wasn't the kind of place people would go unless they absolutely had to. At first, the job seemed easy. I worked the third shift, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and it was just me patrolling the empty aisles, checking the security cameras, and ensuring the gates were locked. The building was mostly silent, except for the occasional hum of the security system and the distant clank of metal crates shifting in the storage sections. I'd heard rumors from other guards about strange noises, flickering lights, and the occasional odd sighting. But I brushed it all off. It wasn't uncommon to hear weird sounds in an old building like this. Still, there was something about the place that always set my nerves on edge. The way the floorboards creaked beneath my boots, the chill in the air that never seemed to leave, and the feeling of being watched even when I was alone. The first strange occurrence happened on my second night working there. I had just finished my rounds on the lower floor and was heading to the upper levels of the warehouse to check the storage rooms. It was around 3 a.m. when I passed a hallway near the old shipping docks. I had walked down this hallway dozens of times, and nothing had ever been out of place. But tonight, as I passed a door at the far end of the hall, I heard something, a faint scraping sound, like metal being dragged across the floor. I stopped, my heart rate speeding up. It wasn't a sound that should have been there, not in a place this deserted. My flashlight flickered once, and I hesitated before shining it down the hallway. Nothing seemed amiss, but the scraping sound continued, growing louder, closer. I walked toward the sound, my boots echoing on the cold concrete. I reached the door where the sound was coming from. It was an old wooden door, chipped and scratched from years of use. I took a deep breath, gripped the handle, and turned it. The door creaked open. The source of the sound wasn't immediately obvious, but then, I saw it. A large metal storage crate, one that had been sitting still for months, was slowly dragging itself across the floor. The metal wheels were making the scraping sound, but there was no one around to move it. It just moved on its own. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. This was one of those moments where I couldn't decide if I was hallucinating or witnessing something supernatural. But I knew one thing for sure: I didn't want to find out more. I quickly shut the door, my hands shaking, and continued my rounds. I kept telling myself it was just a trick of the mind, a result of the dim lighting and the silence playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the image of that crate, creeping across the floor. A few weeks later, things began to escalate. It was late again, around 4 a.m., and I was walking through the main warehouse floor, checking the perimeter, making sure everything was secure. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the sound of my boots on the cold concrete. I turned a corner near the back loading dock when I saw something in my peripheral vision. It was quick, just a fleeting shadow darting across the room, but it was enough to stop me dead in my tracks. My flashlight flickered again, and I found myself holding my breath. There, Just out of the reach of my light, was a tall, black figure standing near one of the high windows. It was the shape of a person, but something was off. The shadow was elongated and dark, with no real details, just a vague humanoid form. I froze, unsure whether I should approach or retreat. But before I could make a decision, the figure vanished into thin air. It didn't move, it didn't fade away, it was just gone. Like it had never been there. I stood in the middle of the warehouse, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. Could it have been a trick of the shadows? Maybe some weird reflection or an issue with the lights? But no matter how I tried to explain it away, I couldn't. That was no ordinary shadow. It wasn't long after the shadow that the voices started. It was another late night, around 2:30 a.m. I had just finished my rounds on the upper floor, and I was making my way back down to the security office. As I passed through the corridor near the old elevator shaft, I heard something strange. At first, I thought it was just the hum of the air conditioning, but then I realized the sound wasn't mechanical. It was people talking. Not loudly, but enough that I could hear the low murmurs, the sound of words I couldn't quite make out. I stopped in my tracks, my blood running cold. There was no one in the building, or at least, there shouldn't have been. I turned and followed the sounds to a door leading into the old maintenance room. The voices seemed to be coming from behind it. My pulse quickened, but I had to investigate. I opened the door slowly, carefully, and peered inside. The room was empty. Not a soul in sight. I checked the security cameras on my tablet, reviewing the footage for the past hour. The building was completely empty, just as it should have been. Yet the voices continued, a low hum, coming from every corner of the room. I checked the air conditioning, the vents, the wiring. Nothing could explain the sounds. That night, I left early, my mind racing with questions I didn't have answers to. Could the building be haunted? Was it all just in my head? Or was there something more sinister going on? As the weeks passed, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Objects would move on their own, doors would slam shut without explanation, and the whispers grew louder. Each time I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it was just the old building settling, but deep down, I knew something was off. It was a Friday night when the most disturbing event happened. I was making my rounds around the perimeter when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, like someone walking just a few paces away. I spun around, expecting to see one of the other security guards. But there was nothing. Just the empty hallway stretching before me. The footsteps didn't stop. They kept coming, closer and closer, but I could see no one. I ran through the hallways, panic setting in. My flashlight flickered again, casting long shadows on the walls. The footsteps echoed behind me, and I could feel a presence, a cold, malevolent force that seemed to be following me. I made it back to the security office and locked the door behind me. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking as I reviewed the cameras. But there was no sign of anyone. The building was empty. There was no one here but me. But I wasn't alone. Not anymore. It's been a year now, and I still work the same shift at the warehouse on Coleridge Lane. The strange events have never stopped, but I've gotten used to them. I still walk the halls, still check the cameras, and still feel the cold presence following me wherever I go. I've come to accept that this place is haunted, haunted by something far darker than I could ever explain. But I can't leave. Not yet. There's something I need to know. Something I have to understand. Maybe it's the ghosts of the past, those who died here long ago, whose souls never left. Or maybe it's something far older, something tied to the land itself. But I know one thing for sure, I'm not the only one here. And I'm not the last. Story: The Silent Hallway. It was my 3rd month working the overnight shift at the building on 5th Avenue. The job itself wasn't difficult, monitoring security cameras, walking the empty halls, making sure nothing was out of place, but the building itself was old. Built in the 1950s, the architecture had a cold, sterile vibe, with long hallways that seemed to stretch on forever, and rooms that hadn't been used in years. Most of the offices were empty at night, with only a few employees working the late shift. The security team was small, just me and one other guard, Mike. Mike worked the first part of the night shift, while I had the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift. The building was huge, and even though it wasn't particularly high-tech, it felt more like a maze of corridors and old stairwells than an office building. I like to think of it as a place where time had slowed down. There was something about it, maybe the dim lighting or the cracked tiles on the floor, that made the air feel heavy, like it was full of secrets. It was 3 a.m. when the incident happened. It was a typical night. I had just finished making my rounds and was about to settle into my chair in the security office to watch the cameras. Mike had left for his break, so I was alone in the office. The building was unusually quiet. The hum of the fluorescent lights above me was the only sound. I didn't mind the silence, in fact, it was comforting. I was used to it. But tonight, something was different. I opened the office door to stretch my legs and get some fresh air. The hallway outside was empty. As I stepped out, I could feel the temperature drop slightly. The warmth of the office was replaced by the coolness of the hallway, and the air seemed denser. There was something off about the stillness in the air. No footsteps, no sounds of people talking, just quiet. As I turned the corner to begin my walk down the long hallway, I felt a chill run down my spine, as if someone were watching me. I paused and looked back. The hallway stretched behind me in both directions, empty. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly, casting long shadows on the walls. I shrugged it off. It was probably just the exhaustion kicking in. I'd been doing this job for a while now, and I was used to the weird feeling of being the only person in the building. Still, something nagged at the back of my mind, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I continued my rounds, checking each door and making sure everything was locked. As I passed by the break room, I noticed the light was still on. I hadn't seen anyone in there for hours. I entered the room to turn off the light, and as I did, I heard a faint sound. It was the sound of paper rustling, like someone was flipping through a book or shuffling through a stack of papers. I froze. The break room was empty. There was no one in sight. I hesitated for a moment, thinking maybe it was just the wind pushing something around. But the sound continued, soft but steady. It wasn't the wind. I stepped into the room fully, scanning every corner, but still no one. The air was thick, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I quickly turned off the light and left, my heart racing slightly. As I walked back into the hallway, the silence was almost suffocating. My footsteps echoed against the cold tile, but suddenly, something caught my attention. A noise. It was faint at first, just a soft thud, like a distant door closing. Then, it was followed by the Unmistakable sound of footsteps. Not mine. These footsteps were slow, deliberate, and they seemed to be getting closer. I froze in place, straining to listen. I looked down the hallway in both directions, but there was no one there. Just the empty hall, stretching endlessly into darkness. The footsteps continued, getting louder and closer, as though someone was walking toward me from the other end of the corridor. I wanted to turn and run back to the security office, but I couldn't move. My feet were frozen in place, and my breath caught in my throat. The footsteps grew louder, now right behind me. I could feel the presence of whoever was there, close enough that it almost felt like they were breathing down my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty. My heart raced in my chest, and I quickly rushed back to the security office, locking the door behind me. I sat at my desk, trying to calm my nerves. My hands were shaking, and my mind was spinning. I glanced at the security cameras, hoping for some kind of explanation. Maybe someone had snuck in. Maybe it was just a prank. But there was no one on the cameras. The building was still completely empty. As I tried to focus on the screens, something caught my eye. A light flickered on the camera feed for the hallway I had just been in. It was the hallway I had just walked through, but the light hadn't been on before. I checked the time. It was now 3:45 a.m. I knew I had turned off all the lights when I did my rounds. But there it was, a faint light, glowing at the end of the hallway. It looked like it was coming from a small office, one that had been abandoned for years. The door to that office was supposed to be locked. In fact, I was the one who had locked it earlier that evening. I stood up, my legs trembling. My instinct told me to ignore it, to stay in the office and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed the flashlight from my desk and slowly made my way down the hallway toward the light. The closer I got, the more I felt a sense of dread settle in my stomach. The footsteps from earlier rang in my ears again, as if they were still following me. When I reached the door of the abandoned office, the light flickered once more. It was coming from under the door, as if someone had turned on a lamp inside. I reached for the handle. The door was cold to the touch. It wasn't locked. I opened it slowly, the creaking of the door echoing in the silence. Inside, the office was completely empty. The light was coming from a small lamp on the desk, casting long shadows across the room. There were no signs of anyone being there. No recent movement, no footprints. I checked the lamp. It had been turned on, but I was certain I hadn't done it. Suddenly, I felt it again, the sensation of being watched. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the dark corners of the room, but there was no one there. A cold breath brushed across the back of my neck, and I heard a whisper, faint but clear. "Leave." I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I rushed back to the security office. I never worked the night shift there again. The next morning, I handed in my resignation. I couldn't shake the feeling of that office, the whispering voice, and the footsteps that had followed me. I still don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. Or maybe something was there in the building, something that had been waiting for me. I'm not sure what the truth is, but I'm certain of one thing: I'm never going back to that place. Story: The Night Watchman. I've worked the night shift at a small, dilapidated office building for nearly 2 years. The building, situated on the outskirts of town, had seen better days. It was originally a factory that had been abandoned for decades before being repurposed into a small office space. There were only a handful of tenants, and most of them were only around during the daytime. At night, I was the only one there. The job itself wasn't difficult. I was a night security guard, tasked with making sure that the building was secure, that the alarm systems worked, and that the few remaining employees left without incident. I'd usually make my rounds, check the locks, and then settle into my small, dimly lit office to monitor the security cameras. My shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. The first few months were uneventful. Nothing ever seemed out of place. The building, though eerie in its silence, was never anything more than an abandoned warehouse with a few odd tenants. But everything changed one night. It was around 3:30 a.m. The building was unnervingly quiet, save for the hum of the security system and the occasional rattle of a loose window pane. I was just finishing up my rounds when I heard something I'd never heard before, a loud thud, followed by a scraping sound. I froze. I sat still for a few seconds, straining my ears, but everything was silent again. I quickly dismissed it as nothing more than the building settling. The pipes were old, and sometimes the wind would cause the metal walls to groan. But then it happened again. Thud. Scrape. I grabbed my flashlight and checked the hallway. Nothing. The building felt oddly empty, even though I knew there were a few employees working late in the building. The offices were all locked, and the security system hadn't triggered any alarms. Still, the sounds persisted, coming from the old maintenance room at the far end of the hall. It had been out of use for as long as I'd been here. I'd never thought much of it before. After all, who would be in there at this time of night? But the noise, it was persistent, like something, or someone, was scratching at the walls, trying to break through. My heart began to race. I checked the security cameras. The maintenance room was empty. I was certain no one was inside, but the noise was undeniable. With a deep breath, I grabbed my radio and spoke into it, trying to contact the other security guard who worked the lower floor. "Kevin, are you there?" Static. Then a faint, crackling voice came through. "Yeah. What's up? Are you hearing that? The banging from the maintenance room?" There was a long pause. "No. I haven't heard anything. What are you talking about?" I hesitated. Maybe it's just the building settling. But I don't know. I'm going to check it out. "Be careful," Kevin said. "It's late, man. You never know with this place." I didn't answer. I didn't want to sound paranoid. I just wanted to figure out what was going on. I made my way down the long corridor toward the maintenance room. The lights flickered as I walked, casting strange shadows against the peeling wallpaper. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if something was watching me from just out of sight. I reached the door to the maintenance room and stopped. The thud, followed by the scraping noise, had stopped, but I could still feel a strange presence. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, like something was off. I hesitated for a moment before gripping the cold door handle and turning it. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the dark room inside. The space was cluttered with old tools, broken furniture, and what appeared to be discarded equipment from when the building was still operational. I shone my flashlight into the room, expecting to see nothing more than dust and shadows. But that's not what I found. In the far corner of the room, standing near the broken window, was a figure. A tall, dark silhouette, completely motionless. My heart stopped. I froze, unable to move or speak. The figure didn't react to the light. It just stood there, like it was waiting for something. I was paralyzed with fear, my hand still gripping the flashlight, my breath shallow and quick. My first instinct was to turn and run, but something inside me pushed me forward. I had to know what it was. I had to know if it was real. "Hello?" I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond. I took a tentative step into the room. The floor creaked under my weight, and the figure suddenly moved. Not towards me, but slowly to the side, disappearing into the shadows. My flashlight flickered. I rushed to the window, hoping for a glimpse of something that would explain what I had just seen, but the room was empty. There was nothing there. I scanned the area outside through the one-way mirror glass. It was just the parking lot, lit by a few street lamps. The wind had picked up again, the storm outside howling. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of footsteps. They were faint at first, almost inaudible over the wind, but they grew louder, closer. I turned toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I checked the cameras again. The hallways were empty. There was no one else in the building, but I could still hear the footsteps. And they were coming closer. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I had to be imagining it. There was no one here. There was no one. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were getting louder, faster. I bolted out of the maintenance room, my flashlight swinging wildly in my hand. I ran back down the hall toward the security office, but before I could reach the door, the lights flickered one last time, and the building plunged into complete darkness. My heart raced, panic setting in. I fumbled for the emergency lights, but they wouldn't turn on. I was blind in the dark. And then I heard it. A voice. Low, raspy. "Help me." I turned, but I couldn't see anything in the pitch-black hallway. The voice came again, closer. This time. "Help me." I screamed, scrambling for the nearest exit, but the door wouldn't open. The wind outside was deafening now, but the footsteps, and the voice, they were all around me. And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The lights flickered back on. The building was completely still. No footsteps. No voice. Nothing. I stumbled out of the building, my hands trembling as I dialed Kevin's number. But there was no answer. No one else was on the other line. I never went back. The next day, I filed my resignation. I never told anyone about that night. No one would believe me anyway. But every now and then, when I'm walking alone at night, I can hear those footsteps again. Faint in the distance. And I can never quite shake the feeling that I'm being followed. Story: The Echoes of the Island. It was the kind of place people talked about in whispers, a remote island off the coast of New England, where the only way in or out was by boat, and even then, the last ferry left long before the sun set. I had never heard of Star Island before, but the moment I was assigned to work the night shift at the retreat center, I knew my life was about to change forever. The job seemed simple enough: monitor the grounds, keep an eye on the security system, and make sure everything was running smoothly. But no one told me about the ghosts. Star Island was home to the Oceanic Hotel, a grand old building that stood as a relic from the early 1900s. It had seen its share of good times and bad, and it seemed like the longer it stood, the more stories it accumulated. According to the locals, the hotel had a strange history. Some said it was cursed, others whispered of the old Unitarian Universalist beliefs that had once permeated the island. Either way, the island had a certain eerie charm that drew people in, even if it was mostly uninhabited during the off-season. In the summer months, it became a haven for people looking to escape from the pressures of the world, whether they were into yoga retreats or historical reenactments. I worked as a janitor during the off-season, a seasonal employee, but my duties also included checking the water storage tanks beneath the hotel. The water came from an old cistern that had been on the island for generations, filtering through pipes that snaked through the building's old structure. The tank sat beneath the porch, hidden from the guests and workers, and it was my responsibility to monitor them to ensure there were no leaks or problems with the water supply. Night after night, I would perform my rounds, checking the tanks and making sure everything was in order. The island was dark and quiet, the only sounds coming from the wind and the occasional bird call. But something was always off about the island at night, an unnatural stillness that seemed to cling to the place, like it was holding its breath. The Oceanic Hotel had a history, one that many of the staff avoided discussing, but I was always curious. I would often catch glimpses of old photographs from when the hotel was a bustling summer destination, and I'd see people dressed in suits and dresses, looking like they had stepped out of another era. On one particularly cold evening, the wind howled through the trees as I made my way toward the kitchen to access the water tanks. The staff area was separated from the guest areas, and guests were discouraged from wandering back there. As I passed through the dining hall, I noticed a man in the corner of the room, his back turned to me. He was wearing a fancy-looking jacket and a bowler hat, his shoes polished to a perfect shine. I immediately assumed he was a guest from the 1920s themed conference that had been taking place on the island earlier that day. "Excuse me, sir," I called out, walking toward him. "Guests aren't allowed in the kitchen area." He didn't respond. His movements were deliberate, almost as if he hadn't heard me at all. I quickened my pace, hoping to catch up to him before he disappeared into the restricted section. But as I reached the kitchen, I found the door wide open and no sign of the man. I felt a brief moment of confusion. He couldn't have gone through that door so quickly, especially not without me noticing. I stepped into the kitchen and glanced around. The walk-in freezer was to my left, and an office sat at the far end of the room, but there was no one in sight. I checked the office, then the freezer, but both were empty. I darted out the back door, looking for the man in the small staff courtyard behind the building. Nothing. Did anyone see a man in the dining hall just now? I asked a few of the staff members who were still awake, lingering near the staff lounge. They all shook their heads. "No one but you and Dave on the rounds tonight," one of them said, her voice heavy with sleep. "You sure you're not seeing things?" I laughed it off, trying to convince myself that I had just missed him, or maybe he had wandered off quickly. After all, it wasn't uncommon for some guests to wander the island after hours, particularly when they missed the ferry or stayed longer than planned. The night wore on, and the strange encounter faded from my mind. That is, until the next morning. As I turned the desk over to the day shift, I passed by the kitchen once again, feeling a chill that wasn't entirely caused by the early morning air. There, on the lawn just outside the Oceanic Hotel, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks, an old photograph, lying on the ground. The photo was yellowed with age, and the edges were frayed, as though it had been buried for years. I bent down to pick it up. The photo was a wide shot of the hotel, taken from a distance, showing the entire front of the building and the surrounding area. It was old, so old that it looked like it had been taken in the early 1900s. But what caught my attention was the man standing in the foreground, just past the small cemetery near the edge of the property. He was wearing the same clothes as the man I had seen the night before, a fancy jacket, a bowler hat, and polished shoes. The photo seemed to capture a moment from the past. But the eerie part was that the man in the photo looked exactly like the one I had encountered in the dining hall. The realization hit me hard, like a punch to the gut. The man had never been a guest at all, he was a ghost, a relic from another time, lingering in the present like a shadow. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the photograph. The air around me felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. I wasn't frightened, though. In fact, I felt oddly calm, as if I had stumbled upon something I was meant to see. Maybe the island was playing tricks on me. Or maybe I had witnessed something paranormal. Either way, it didn't matter. The man I had seen was gone, and I had the photograph as proof that I wasn't imagining things. As I returned to the kitchen, I could still hear the echoes of the man's footsteps in my mind. Perhaps he was just a manifestation of the past, a ghostly replay of an old memory, caught in a loop. I had seen him, just like my mother had once felt someone sit on her bed in the same hotel years ago. Maybe the island had a way of preserving memories, or maybe it just liked to remind those who worked here that it had seen things no one could explain. The rest of the summer passed without incident. I continued my rounds, checked the water tanks, and performed my duties as a janitor. But every time I passed through the dining hall, I would glance at the photograph I had found, and I would smile to myself. The man in the photo had been real, at least, he had been real in some sense. And I had seen him. The summer ended, and I left Star Island with a sense of wonder. The experience had been strange, but it was one that stayed with me. There was something haunting about the island. Something that reached out to those who spent enough time there. I couldn't explain it, but I didn't need to. I had seen it for myself, and that was enough. Hey everyone, Mort here. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening to tonight's stories. I really hope you enjoyed them. If you did, it would mean a lot to me if you could drop a like and hit that subscribe button. And if you made it all the way to the end and aren't subscribed yet, well, that'd be awesome too. I put out new videos every week, so I hope you'll stick around. A huge thanks to my amazing members and patrons. You guys rock, and your names are right there on the screen. If you like this video, I think you'll enjoy this one too, so why not give it a watch? Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.